Okay. Cool. I guess I'll take this here. Okay, cool. I'm gonna start in 3, 2, 1. The value of African sports, specifically AFCON within the African context, has always been the fact that it's a very important sport in terms of the football calendar within Africa, by virtue of what it does to Africa particularly. It allows us to have bragging rights on the international spectrum. Why do we think this is inherently not existent on their side of the house? It is far more harder to win AFCON comparatively, and therefore it's far more harder to access mechanisms by which you're able to create the best form of identity for yourself, which means then that the most proximate way to create development within Africa and development of sports within Africa is if we're able to create tools for us to create that development, and what Chan uniquely allows is for that mechanism to exist. But secondly, and I think this is important to note, I think it's important to note the influence of coaches within the creation and the development of talent. Note what you do on their side uniquely when you create quota systems. What you do when you create quota systems is that there's a minimum incentive to create accessibility for the development and the creation of talent within Africa. Why is this the case? What coaches can literally do when quota systems exist is to just say, look, we've put these individuals within our clubs, we don't have to have them play, we fulfilled the minimum quota within that regard. Why do we think this is inherently problematic? We'd say that this is problematic specifically because there's no incentive to develop those talents insofar as you're just creating tools for them to access. We don't value that insofar as you harm domestic talent and the ability for them to play within spectrums and allow them to be able to exist outside or within systems that are particularly beneficial to them. But why do we think that we are better in Chan? What Chan allows uniquely is the creation of exclusively domestic talent. So what you do in terms of coaches within these spectrums is that you are unable to exclude them, specifically because they are domestic within that regard. But secondly, what Chan uniquely does is that it allows for individuals who otherwise wouldn't be able to access national teams to be able to access some form of development. Why is this uniquely important? We'd say that this is important specifically because Africa has always had a problem with the creation of talent, particularly who are able to play within the AFCON within that regard. But secondly, what we'd say quota systems uniquely do on their side is that you create barriers of access to entry specifically for players within who are able to otherwise access it without these systems. Comparatively, what Chan does here, but the problem with quota systems is to specifically remove access for people who need it the most. People like the domestic players who actively need that representation that they want to speak about and able to get that functionally. We think what Chan comparatively does is that it allows individuals to be given the access to things such as scouting, which allows to domestic players who otherwise wouldn't be able to access the upliftment to be able to do this. Secondly, currently what African states don't the reason why Africa specifically is uniquely beneficial in the way that it exists is that we don't have the Western player problem. And what this Western player problem inherently looks like is the idea that the only individuals who are able to access the national teams or able to access AFCON is at the point at which you have existed within Western Western sporting clubs. So the idea that you have to play within European leagues in order for you to be seen as inherently worthy of accessing AFCON within that regard. What is the intuition here? We think that Nigeria doesn't qualify for the specifically for the World Cup specifically because it is part of the specifically this Western player problem. What we say here, what you do comparatively on our side when Chan exists, is that it allows for the creation of pipelining of domestic talent, specifically because you don't have to meet the you don't have to meet the standards of these specific sporting codes who exist outside of you. Why do we think that this is inherently beneficial? What we think you do when you create quota systems is that you have to revise the entire way by which you go about the creation of scouting and the creation of talent. And the problem here is that in the absence of quota systems, there's been a limited ability and capacity for individuals to develop the best form of scouting. why do we think, the first form of why quota systems on their side uniquely become problematic is on 4 layers. We think number 1, quotas uniquely allow specific subjective forms of who we get to define as people who deserve the access into AFCON in the first place. That is to say, we think you have to meet the lens of subjective scouts who don't have the incentive for you to create mechanisms for you to uplift. But secondly, you have to be measured against standards that you aren't proximate to in the first place. Thirdly, you are punished at the point at which you are unable to meet up to those standards. But fourthly then, you are then told by those people that you can exist. What Chan uniquely allows, what quota systems don't allow, is for an immediate relief for individuals to be able to access these sports uniquely, otherwise they wouldn't be able to do that. We think what quota systems uniquely does is that it removes from the universalist ideas by which sports have always been particularly beneficial to. So comparatively,
a lot of South African football fans really like the PSL, for example. Do you think they would like watching Bafana Bafana if the majority of them, the players there, were from the European League instead of, for example, the PSL?
The creation of an African identity is uniquely important, and Chan uniquely allows for us to be able to create this. We don't think you get that at the point at which you uniquely allow for people only who are seen as good by Western spectrums and Western lenses to be the ones to be able to access that. Not sure what they're getting at there. Lastly then, in terms of a positive matter, what do you think then the world with Chan uniquely makes sports more visible for Africa? We think sports in Africa is uniquely valuable for 2 reasons. Number 1, sports has always been determined on the creation of identities, but specifically then it forms communities around localized talent. What Chan uniquely allows is for us to see that domestic talents are also able to be good, specifically because you are able to develop them within this particular regard. In the absence of Chan, quota systems don't allow for you to be able to see the development of localized talents, specifically because they are excluded from mechanisms that allow them to be able to access that in that regard. You think you are far more harmful to domestic players in that regard. Why do we think that this is inherently problematic? We'd say that this is problematic specifically because you don't create changes in terms of the perception of Africa and African sports on their side of the house that they uniquely wanted to fight for. Comparatively, Chan uniquely allows for an approximation of a domestic spectrum and a domestic identity that ourselves are able to define and we are able to particularly identify with. The essential problem in this debate is on who is able to create an identity for Africa and African players to be able to exist. And what we tell you that Chan does is uniquely create a domestic mechanism for us to be able to scout players that uniquely are able to create mechanisms for them to access sports that they otherwise wouldn't have in the absence of quota systems. When you allow for quota systems, you allow for subjective interpretations of objective means of sports, and we think you are harmful for sports in itself. Universalism is inherently important. Chan allows that, and they don't more than proud to propose.
Now, thanks to the Leader of Opposition for that fine speech. We now welcome the Deputy Prime Minister to the debate.
In terms of POIs, just ask. I'll take 2. I'll try my best to take 2. I'm trying. It's still not yet. Alright. If I speak at this, I'm going to this again. Actually, things. I'm going to start the speech in 3, 2, 1, go. Identity is important on all sides. African identity, in fact, is the most central thing that OO wants you to believe. But there are preconditions for you to develop an identity. one, you have to have access to capital, and especially when it looks at sports, you have to have viewership. You have to have people retweeting and posting about the goals being scored in that tournament. You have to have scouts being pulled out to those tournaments to view those players. So if it's about creating an African identity, you want to create an identity where there are most people viewing African players being the best that they can. A couple of responses to whatever OO says. OO says that it is hard to win AFCON. A couple of responses here. One, winning is difficult on both sides of the world. So I think this is symmetric. But let me flip that. The fact that it's difficult is a good thing. The fact that it's difficult is why most players and most viewerships will watch that. That's why you wait for 5 years to watch the World Cup, because the World Cup is difficult. It combines all the most biggest players in the world. That is true, because if the tournament is as difficult as they say, then it is valuable for players. Because if the tournament is difficult, you are much more likely going to have scouts. You are much more likely going to have, like companies like DSTV bid for the tourship, for the viewership rights to broadcast a lot of those things within the local countries. That's important, and you only get that when the tournament is difficult, when you can actively engage with it. Not yet. But secondly, they say that, the coaches are from this domestic league, and they say, that barriers are created by quotas. I just think that this response ignores what a quota system is. A quota system is something that breaks barriers to access, right? Because on their side, the barrier to access is that coaches never look at people who are in CHAN. CHAN is not as difficult. CHAN doesn't have a long period of time where you're in a different country and struggling. Comparatively speaking, people associate that optically to AFCON. They associate difficulty and quality and class to AFCON in comparison of CHAN. This is true because that is the quota system. Because on their side, no one who plays in CHAN ever goes to AFCON. Why? CHAN is used as a scapegoat for federations within your country not to put you in AFCON, not to put you in the main team. That is a bad harm, especially for players who are trying to get themselves out there. But secondly, they say, and I really want to explain that why is the quota system breaks a barrier, right? Because what is a barrier? A barrier is when you're prevented to go to a certain place, right? And that's like the players are prevented to go to AFCON. But how do you solve this? You don't solve this by consistently investing in AFCON. You solve this by creating a quota system that allows them play in AFCON. You solve this by giving them specific slots and say, the players who would have ordinarily picked for CHAN, we shall take them to AFCON and they must play in that A team. You force the coaches to integrate them within that team. That is the quota system when you send players to AFCON. But the second thing I want to say here is that they say that there's a Western problem. And I want to say that I don't think he really explains why this is a problem, but I want to flip this too. The Western problem is not a bad thing. Why? Because when DJ Drogba comes to play for Ivory Coast at the AFCON, people come and watch them. Those Western players are necessary because they already have viewership. That viewership is important because that viewership is where Drogba says, I have teammates who are good, come and scout them. And we saw people like Mikel Obi actually going to places like Chelsea. This is important because those players come and present African identity. Even if CEO wants to extend that because you have Western players, all the attention is going to be on them. That is simply not true. Why? Because when they play in African countries, they play with the Ubuntu, they play together. And I think that togetherness is what encourages them to show that, also these other players can play the game. But lastly, they say that, you're unable to meet unrealistic standards. Pano, if AFCON is the goal, if you make yourself used to a CHAN standard, you are unable to beat the standard at AFCON. The problem, for example, let's relate it to debate, right? If you consistently debate in poor circuits, it is unlikely for you to do well at Worlds. You're required to debate in those circuits at Worlds. That is why they give us a quota system, which gives us scholarships to go to Worlds and ensure that we also integrate within that system. On their side, the standards they have are unrealistic. But lastly, I want to really demystify this thing that, the standards on our side are a bit unrealistic. A couple of illustrations here. One, he's lying. The national coaches of CHAN and AFCON are usually foreign guys. So they can't say that, now there's going to be this imperialistic standard. But secondly, I want to note that a lot of the pro they are going to claim that there's exclusion. It's not as big as they claim it is. One, a lot of the coaches and managers are coaches and managers within local teams, like medics and all these people. So that is to say, they don't just lose their jobs the way they want you to believe, they still retain their jobs in domestic leagues where they play. But second of all, they can still get absorbed into those national teams that go to AFCON. Why is this true? They are highly skilled people who are helping people at CHAN. Because we want to conceive that players at CHAN have skill. If they have skill, you want them to show their skill at the highest level. What do these responses do entirely to the overall case? I think these responses show you that one, a lot of the harms they say in terms of like Western imperialism are quite similar because you have all quotas coming from Western African countries. But most importantly, I think what I'm able to do is to flip a lot of their claims and say the difficultiness they say gives us viewership. The difficultiness they say gives us sponsorship. The difficulty they say gives us access to give players who have talent to grow themselves. CEO.
I want to show that identity is the biggest issue for African football players. That can't be the challenge.
Yeah, that's what OO wants you to believe. But like, we don't believe that. We think what's important is you giving players access to be able to grow themselves. What is the most important clash in this debate? And I want to note, they don't respond to the chunk of analysis OISA gives you as to why it is hard to reform the chunk. It is hard to reform it because a lot of the bias optically is already on AFCON. They need to show you why you're going to get all those players, all those viewerships from AFCON and take them to CHAN and have the best possibility for them to succeed. Why does AFCON matter? And it's crucial for us to give those players the quota system there. One, most of Africans players who are poached from AFCON. OISA gives you a killer illustration about Latin America and how players like Istanbul have been able to go to those places because they've been given quotas to play on the country system. But second of all, the highest amount of viewership of African football and resources is concentrated literally on AFCON. Shell, a big MNC, literally funds that tournament. That is to say, they have lots of resources to benefit them. But lastly, the highest aspiration of football players want to win AFCON. Even if we call Mohamed Salah the biggest player, he did not yet win an AFCON. And when he actually won an AFCON, we actually like praise him. That's important because AFCON is crucial. If you want to win an African identity, you need a space that has resources to benefit those players. National players are benefited like that. The last thing I want to say is that in the best case that you believe them, that they say that like you're unlikely going to get this a lot of rich resources, always explain to you that when you now ensure that highly skilled CHAN players are playing in AFCON, you encourage investment and scouting in more national leagues. This happened in South Africa. This is why the PSA is growing. Vote for side opening government.
Thanks to the Deputy Prime Minister for the final speech. We now welcome the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Okay, I'll take a peer from anyone. Please try you can just stand up and raise your hand. Please don't realize just be a little bit disturbing. Okay. Okay, I'm going to be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. A lot of OG's case would matter if CHAN and AFCON had the same incentives. Those two different incentives means everything that they speak about things like capital, about things like being able to get players to, have visibility and have all of these instances in terms of how they exist in AFCON. Those things would matter if those two things have the same incentives. The reason CHAN existed by AFCON creating it, specifically CAF creating it, is fundamentally because there's a problem in Africa of professionalization of leagues, which ultimately created the problem of the westernization of national teams. That's the reason why CHAN existed in the first place. So it meant, even in an instance in which CHAN is specifically not a thing that is much visible, you don't pay to go watch it, it's not a problem because the reason it exists fundamentally is the ability to create development within the African leagues because it doesn't exist outside of that. That is the very reason why CHAN exists in the first place. Second, the idea of quota systems are about you being included in the squad, not whether you play. This is a very important thing because a lot of their cases dependent on visibility of these players. If it is true and you buy all the analysis that they say, especially in the DPL speech, to say that we're fine with Western players, we're fine with how hard it is, and we love the attention that AFCON gets, they have to also buy into the idea that the likely individuals that are going to play are the ones that are going to get the attention, not the ones that don't have the incentive to fit the team structure. Thirdly, how do coaches choose players? First, team identity. Secondly, success. It means if all of these instances are things that need to be met by how national team structures function, they have to specifically say that these coaches and how they function have the incentive to include them in the 23-man squad. Fourthly, and most importantly, this is why I don't think they can dumb down Kuma's speech, is the idea that currently African football does not have a Western player problem. The teams that have been able to be successful currently in the World Cup qualifiers, in qualifying for the AFCON, have been majority based on domestic league players. Bafana currently on win streaks and being able to qualify for both and beating teams like Nigeria and Ghana, has specifically been able to qualify with 98% of domestic league players. These things matter and only exclusively happen at a point in time which you don't create systems that just cap on how far you can be able to include domestic players. This is exclusively existing when China exists because you're able to create a timeline. I don't think the things that they speak about are specifically something that matter. But secondly, I think this goes into direct responses on just how things like barriers to access. I think it's very important to understand that I think at the point in time in which you are funding quota systems and just saying you want to structurally create a system and a policy that tells teams what they need to do in order to meet something, it means you also have to specifically then bite the bullet and say you are fine with just teams being able to say if we just create the minimum of individuals and just keeping everything else, we are fine with that. The problem with the minimization of things and say you only need to meet the minimum of something is that it means you're unable to get the best form of talent but also the best form of development for yourself for two reasons strategically. The first one is that at a point in time which you say you want the largest talent pool here, it means you limit it specifically to the individuals that can fit the very same structure of those individuals. What does this mean in terms of barrier to access? It is true, the access is given to those domestic players if we had a Western-based problem. But the problem is, it means the players from those domestic leagues that get to meet the quota are the players that probably are the best in the leagues. China exclusively, the reason why it functions and the reason why people don't watch it, it's not because players like Tim Bikosi launch in the PSL or like players that exist like really good in like Wanda are able to play in it. They don't have a problem, they can go to AFCON. They really don't have a problem to make it to AFCON. The players that don't make it are the ones that play for small teams, but those domestic leagues are not the premiership leagues but semi-professional leagues. Those are the players that make it to Chad. When you create a quota system for domestic leagues, like entirely, it means the barrier to access is heightened to meet the players that are the best already, because that's literally how you can able to meet the quota systems. It means you harm all the developmental players and you harm everybody else that could have had the pipeline of engaging the idea of existing within the high leagues of like AFCON in this instance. We think this is much more harmful, specifically for the individuals that the most harm and the reason why China exists for in the first place. But thirdly, I think this does make you understand that China doesn't exist for like height players. So like the good players don't need China. It's the players that don't get attention. And it means quota systems, if you're saying 5 out of 23 people, it means you have to take the best 5 out of 23 people. That's literally the logic here. They need to engage that world. We don't think they're able to solve anything. The extension is very simple. I'm going to be talking about the idea of competitive fairness within the African context and why specifically a very important thing to specifically continue the direct development pipeline and how we are able to exist. Let's talk about how competitive fairness is specifically there. I think first thing we need to outline is that our government has to prove that quotas are synonymous with development. This is a very important thing to specifically speak about, because I think my analysis and responses to tell you specifically how coaches already choose players based on team identity but also on things like success. It means that these players necessarily get excluded from those such things because already they have the idea or like the stigmatization from the African context of they are just simply quota players and not necessarily players that deserve to be there. It means if we all believe that AFCON is so great and AFCON is central to how we view football in Africa, it means you have to specifically engage a role in which we have pride in the teams that play in such instances. So it means the players that exist there have to particularly meet the standard of success and how they are able to engage. So even if they were good, it's the idea of how they got into that necessarily makes them very harmful for how they're able to exist. I'm going to show you why it makes it much more harmful because of the competitive nature of how AFCON functions and how you harm all other developmental leagues. But sure, see you. I see you.
The thing is, in status quo, there are alternatives like the CAF Confederation Cup and CAF Champions League, which allow us to get visibility and develop these players who genuinely doesn't have a case.
Yeah, but like that's for domestic players. They're gonna play anyway. I don't understand. They play this domestic teams there. I don't know, but also the teams that qualify for CAF Champions Leagues are the ones that are the best teams in the leagues. I don't think the debate is about the best teams in the league. The debate is about the players that are unlikely to get visibility. That's the debate here. But competitive fairness specifically is there. The African context is a professionalization problem. There are literally 2 leagues in Africa that are able to actually have a development pipeline. Literally South Africa, the pipeline of being able to have 90% like domestic based players is because of that good development initiative and pipeline into the national team. It doesn't exist outside because you get a corporate mechanism to just simply put players into that because you don't necessarily need to develop your own players in order for them to be successful because you simply get you don't get the incentive for those states to really develop the development to develop the very same players they speak about. So things like professionalization of leagues, but the retention of players to stay in your country, not go to Western countries, that exist exclusively at the point in time which is a corporate mechanism where you don't need to develop them, but you can just simply slot them into quotas. That exists exclusively when you create a quota system because they have to engage what quota systems are. And not necessarily quota systems in their own world and how it exists there. That's the reason why we can open opposition resistance.
Thanks to you all for the fine speech. We welcome the member to begin the just
I consented to streaming, so it's okay. I will engage openly just to give you a chance to respond to us. Okay. Starting 3, 2, 1. Chair, I need you to note something. The African footballers don't do this as a hobby. This is their source of livelihood. So they don't care if it's second league or third league. They get to play, they get paid, they get to be seen. That's the most important thing. It's not as if, and also it's not analogous to European leagues. We don't have developed infrastructure enough. These individuals lack an opt-out mechanism. These people put their lives on the line every single weekend to try and entertain people. Even if they're playing in front of a crowd of 10 people, even if it's 5 countries, at least they get paid and at least they get seen, and that's very important for such discussions to happen. But let me introduce a couple of things just to add to the discussion we're having so far. First is that we don't have to choose. No, the conversation from government teams so far seems to suggest we can't have it both ways, that one poisons the other. But opening government says, hey, AFCON won't allow them to play because they chose CHAN, so because of that we must, Confederation of African Football must actually bring down CHAN, for example. That just doesn't make sense because if we can prove to you that they exist in a complementary nature that allows us to occupy the African airspace against European football, and that this is something that's economically beneficial because that's the extension from closing opposition, I do think we're doing significantly well. The two things in terms of context. First, the rise of nationalistic sentiments when it comes to African football and AFCON. Recently, FIFA decided that more African teams can actually go and play at FIFA. That's why Ghana qualifies. But the conversation happening in Ghana, local Ghanaians are a bit divided when having foreigners coming in and playing for them. So most of them are not sure if we should trust them because they've trained abroad and we should allow them to come back in when they rejected our calls to qualify at AFCON. But because they've actually come in now, please stop doing that. It's quite annoying. It's actually really bad. Stop doing it. But most importantly here, we say that so it means that the diaspora conversations are quite divided to the degree where people are unsure if they should trust these people. This means individuals want African football that they can identify with, but not identify with just in the sense of identity as they mentioned, but identify with in the sense that allows them to make money locally, that allows local companies like Tusker, when CHAN happened in Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania this year, for them to invest like Tusker did, for example. But secondly, CHAN developing complementary structures. For example, it has a women's league, it has a youth league, for example. All these things are grassroots mechanisms that allow significantly more African football players to get training, which means you don't just have AFCON football training academies, you just don't have national football training academies like KPLC, for example, the Kenya Premier League. You have significantly more. I'm unclear why they are against more people getting more access to more jobs anyway. That just doesn't make sense. But most importantly, CHAN and AFCON do not happen at the same time. They happen concurrently. The block scheduling, this is something that's used internationally for football, means that African airspace when it comes to football is consistently occupied. The issue here, closing opposition, as we point out, when AFCON happens, there's hype around it, but that hype dies down because nothing continues that hype. There is no other big African football competition happening at the same time that brings together the continent. CHAN does significantly that, so you're consistently consuming African football because you don't have to now turn to European football, for example. So the gap that exists because of just AFCON existing happens. But most importantly, the affirmative action in the name of quota systems they want to introduce doesn't help African teams succeed at the international level, right? Because we still want African players to come back and play for AFCON so that we can qualify FIFA. They have significantly more training, they've got significantly better coaching internationally. This means we do two things at closing opposition: develop local talent, but allow African teams to shine when it comes to FIFA, for example, at the international level. The quota system kills the Africans' ability to shine at international levels, but also creates the myth that our local African players have access to to better training mechanisms at CHAN, for example. Argument 1 on principle. While principally unfair for local players, there are 3 things under this. First, that developing talent would be benched on their side. Even if you can introduce a quota system that says 95% of players at AFCON have to be local African players, it does a couple of things. It means you're not strong enough because they're developing talent, as I mentioned. 15 seconds, please. But most importantly, it does mean that you're not as successful as you can be at AFCON because you only have 5% of the best trained talent coming in. But the worst part here, it means that you're going to lose your spot. And this is the issue that's being discussed in Ghana, because now local trained players are going to lose their slots to international players coming in because they are better trained, because intuitively you'd want to perform the best at international levels. So if this talent is good and promising but you already have finished product somewhere, you're likely going to use them. This is unfair for local players who put their lives on the line, who are already underpaid and undertrained, for example, and that's significantly bad. CHAN offers them an example where you can train them with the consideration of they're not that good, they don't have access to that many resources, but most importantly, it gives them access to how many more competitions that they can win and how many more competitions they can participate in as such. The second thing is less incentive to grow local talent, because the savior complex attributed to the 5% that will come in, even if you cap it at 95, means coaches have lesser incentive or governments have lesser incentive to put in money. And they concede to this. They say AFCON is already successful. It's been there for a while. But local leagues in countries like Kenya have lesser incentive to develop. We say introduce another league. If they have more competitions continentally to compete in, it means they have bigger reasons to actually train significantly more and maybe try to get better. This is something that you don't get if we are all consistently holding our breath, looking forward to AFCON biannually, and then when it doesn't happen, there's nothing going on. The block scheduling is very important. But 3, the lack of opt-out mechanisms. Local African players lack alternatives that these individuals might have on their side. So even if you can say, and I agree to them, sure, let's cap it at 90, let's cap it at 70. Even if you can have 70, can you please fucking sit down? Thank you. Even if you have 70% of local African players participating at this level, there's still significantly more people that are not going to participate. More women and more youth that won't do it. Their training academies that AFCON provides are simply not enough. So we provide significantly more avenues on this side of the conversation. 2, the complementary nature. African football, this is framing. African football is fighting for viewership against European leagues. European leagues are significantly easy for people to access. Everyone in this room probably owns an Arsenal jersey or etc. This means local players, even at AFCON level, are not getting seen. This means that if AFCON hype is built up and then disregarded at every other cycle, it makes it significantly harder to work with. Which means many more people will be watching African sports. Things like viewership, endorsements, sponsorships are things that will increase on our side because there's a consistent supply of African football. Even if it's not to the quality of closing government, they don't prove why African football quality would improve on their side anyway, because they also agree to the fact that local leagues have no incentive to improve. We show you our local league have incentive to improve, more trophies to be won, but also that you actually increase the number of viewership. But the most important thing here, while opening significantly proves that you get viewership, we'll show you what to do with that viewership. This is the second argument, the development of African sport. There are 3 things here. The incentive to develop local league, the growing of KPLC and whatnot. 2, grassroots development, constant training because you have more jobs and more leagues to be won. But lastly, smaller African companies can now invest in some of these leagues, for example. This significantly means you have Tusker in Kenya putting their money into CHAN because it's significantly cheaper for them to advertise it as compared to AFCON, which means more smaller African companies are able to advertise most of their product, which means more visibility, more money being poured into sports, more avenues for investment at such smaller levels. We are more than happy to provide.